With Black Flag Resynced right around the corner, and there being new quests and storylines for some of the original game's cast, I've been thinking a lot about some of the characters that could really benefit from some added screen time, and I think Stede Bonnet is chief among them. Stede is one of those characters in a game that once you replay, you realize he's not in it as much as you remember. His impact and memorability far outweighs his actual screen time. In fact, I counted it up, he's only in 12 scenes in the entire game, and in a few of those he's just in the backdrop with a line or two. But his presence and dynamic with Edward is so memorable that it's always felt like he's in the game more than he actually is to me. Stede is one of many historical figures in Black Flag. Almost every important character in this game is a real person, apart from some like Edward, Caroline, Adewale, Atabai, and I guess Julian Ducasse. When I first played the game way back when, I had no idea Stede was a real person. I knew the obvious ones like Blackbeard and Charles Vane, but I would not have guessed the comic relief sidekick was a real guy. His story just seemed too ridiculous to be true, but it is. Known as the Gentleman Pirate, he had a fascinating and tragic story that the game only touches on in passing. And this is where Resynced has the opportunity to flesh out and explore this very interesting historical figure more. He's supposed to be getting his own side quest line in Resynced, so hopefully that provides ample opportunity to do so. Limited screen time in the original game aside, I've always appreciated Stede as a character and what he provides the narrative. I really like James Bachman's performance. He nails that bumbling, enthusiastic energy along with the awkward facial expressions and body language, making him a really fun counterpoint to Edward in their scenes. But after the opening in Havana and a brief re-emergence around halfway through the game, Stede ends up being left behind by the plot, where the rest of his story occurs off-screen. The game only mentions what happens to him in passing through ambient dialogue between two guards during the prison mission in Sequence 11, dialogue that is very easily missable, I might add. In fact, I did miss it the first time I played this game, and I remember being confused when seeing Stede at that table of all of Edward's lost friends at the end, thinking I somehow missed his death scene. So I want to dedicate this video to my boy Stede, why I love his friendship and dynamic with Edward, and his tragic end that we don't get to see any of in the game. Stede Bonnet was born in 1688 in Barbados to very wealthy plantation owners. His parents passed away when he was only 7 years old, leading to him inheriting the plantation and said wealth. He married young, where he had 4 children, yet despite his very leisurely and comfortable lifestyle, he never felt fulfilled or satisfied. To complicate things, his firstborn son had died in infancy, leaving him perpetually unhappy by his domestic life. Before he even met Edward, he had dreams of leaving his tedious life behind and sailing free on the open water. But, in Assassin's Creed anyway, meeting Edward was the catalyst that set that dream in motion. Stede and Edward have a very fun dynamic. I think they're one of the better comedic duos of the franchise, maybe right behind Connor and Haytham. Edward is the experienced, rough around the edges, cunning pirate, while Stede is the sophisticated, upbeat, bright-eyed comic relief who's naive enough to believe all of the lies and deceptions Edward sells him without second thought. And we see Edward in the beginning constantly taking advantage of Stede. Stede seems to think they're becoming genuine friends, while Edward, at least at first, is using him as a means to an end, using his ship and crew to get to Havana, his money to buy weapons, and when the guards beat Stede to a pulp and confiscate his sugar, believing him to be Edward's accomplice, Edward only cares about getting his possessions back.
Shit! Alright, come on, let's follow them and recover my maps.
And my sugar?
What, in my drawers? We'll see what happens.
Later on, Edward has the opportunity to retrieve Stede's sugar, but leaves it behind with little thought or hesitation, which says a lot about who Edward is at the beginning of the story in a very brief scene. Sure, it wouldn't have been easy to smuggle out of the fort, but he didn't even make an effort because he simply didn't care. It'd be an inconvenience and wouldn't help him in any way to do so. This is who Edward is at the start of Black Flag. If it doesn't further his own ambitions, he couldn't care less. Though he's not completely heartless, he does still seem to feel slightly bad. He gives Stede a bag of coin and encourages him to sail for Nassau. He can tell Stede is dissatisfied with his current lifestyle, that he yearns for more. And as a show of trust, or perhaps an apology for getting him beaten up and leaving his sugar behind, Edward divulges his true name to him, which Stede, being the naive fellow he is, almost immediately proves to be a mistake.
Edward? Hello, Edward! I found a man to purchase my remaining sugar! Quite a coup, I must say.
He just called you Edward.
Oh, that's the merchant who sailed me here. Out of caution, I gave him a false name.
Ah, well done.
We'll catch up on it later.
I think like most players, Edward initially finds Stede annoying, but starts to become endeared towards his goofy, jovial personality over time. Though it's still a pretty one-sided friendship at first.
How's a man supposed to become rich in these times with a miser like Torres running the world?
Have you ever worked on a plantation before?
You know what I'm thinking? I'd like to see this observatory the governor's going on about.
It's like he's talking to himself in this scene. He straight up ignores Stede, who I believe is actually getting at offering Edward a job on his plantation. He hears him complaining about money, which Stede has plenty of, and is trying to help his new friend out. But Edward wouldn't take the job anyway. As established, he's not satisfied with making a livable wage. He wants to be rich and become a man of status. He wants acknowledgement. Working for Stede wouldn't fulfill that. In the 3 years that passed before the pair met again, Stede went home to Barbados and, inspired by Edward, decided to take the leap and become a pirate. He had a ship built, which was already uncommon for pirates to do, they typically stole ships to use, and he paid his crew a salary. Also very uncommon, and something he likely had to do in order to convince experienced pirates to actually sail under a clueless captain. From there, he said goodbye to the wife and kids, and set out to live as a man of fortune. His poor family, can you imagine? That takes Dad leaving to get the milk to a different level. And his fate being what it is, his family would never see him again. In a lot of ways, Stede is the antithesis of the traditional pirate. For starters, he didn't look or act like one at all. He wore fine clothes, was well educated, and even had his own private library installed in his ship quarters. There's a reason they called him the gentleman pirate. Plus, he had all the money he could ever need, which is the primary motivation for most people turning to piracy to begin with, yet he did because he wanted to. He was discontent and unhappy with his life. He basically had a midlife crisis and decided he wanted the thrill and freedom of adventure. He broke bad, if you would. Edward inspired him to make that selfish choice despite all the responsibilities he had back home. Now, considering the fact that Stede had zero pirating experience and didn't know how to sail or fight, things pretty much immediately went wrong for him. His overly ambitious crew attacked a Spanish man-o'-war where they took some heavy losses, so he sailed for Nassau as Edward recommended and joined Blackbeard's crew, which is how he and Edward are eventually reunited. I love the goofy little eye patch they gave him. He looks like he's cosplaying. The guy is so out of his depth, but man, he just looks happy to be there. You just know he's never felt more alive, and like Edward, it seems Blackbeard took a bit of a liking to Stede, bringing him under his wing. After some time learning under Blackbeard, he eventually cut Stede loose and let him have his old ship and crew back, where Stede hoped to get a privateering contract to take down Spanish ships. And as he set sail on his new journey as his own captain once more, he ran into Edward one last time.
Hey, old Bonnet! Flying your own flag at last.
Yes, Blackbeard cut me loose, sadly. Time to have a go at this myself.
Well, that's grand.
Yes, it's for the best, I think. I should have some wild stories when next we meet. Edward, your constant friendship has been my most treasured find on these seas. Well above gold and silver and rum, I prize the courage you have inspired in me this year. Thank you, sir. A fair good morrow to you.
This scene is honestly heartbreaking when you realize it's the last time Edward and Stede would ever see each other. Even though Edward was really only taking advantage of him in the beginning, you can tell he grew to genuinely view Stede as a good friend. There's a reason he's one of the apparitions he sees at that table in the end. It's a really bittersweet scene and all the more emotional knowing what happens to Stede afterwards. Things began to fall apart very quickly for him. He gets trapped in the northern colonies due to hurricanes and, in need of supplies, turns back to pirating, which eventually led to Stede and his crew's capture at the hands of the pirate hunter, Colonel William Rhett. This happened differently in real life. In real life, Stede was actually betrayed by Blackbeard, who stole all his supplies and treasure, leaving Stede and his crew feeling like they had no other choice but to turn back to piracy. In fact, they were on a revenge mission to track down Blackbeard for a while before getting captured. I imagine this change was made in the game to better fit the structure of the story and keep the focus on Edward. Plus, keeping it true to history might have turned the player and Edward against Blackbeard when that's not the direction they wanted to take it. But the end result of Stede being captured is ultimately the same. Almost the entirety of Stede's crew was sentenced to death and hanged. Stede actually managed to temporarily escape confinement, but was shortly after recaptured and sentenced to death himself. He desperately begged and pleaded to be spared. He reportedly offered to have his own arms and legs amputated to ensure he would never return to piracy again, which garnered a lot of public sympathy from the people. Even the colonel who captured him offered to sail him to London for a retrial, but all to no avail. As Stede was dragged to the gallows, he showed great remorse, crying and pleading for his life, literally moving the spectating crowd to tears, but was hanged anyway. Stede was a very naive character. He seemed almost blissfully unaware of the consequences of what he was doing. He was too busy having the time of his life to seriously consider the ramifications of his actions, and you can imagine how hard that harsh reality must have hit him in the days leading up to his death. How swiftly the fun became regret and fear. All of this is completely off screen in the game. We don't even hear about Stede's death until 3 years after it happens in 1721, when Edward is being held in that Jamaican prison. The only mention of his death is by these two guards, whom you can very easily miss.
Or money, like Stede Bonnet from Barbados.
No, they hanged him too.
Did they?
Aye. Blubbering and bawling. He collapsed at the gallows. Weeping like a little lamb.
Serves the bastard right.
So some players, like I did when I first played the game, may not have known what actually happened to Stede before seeing him as one of the apparitions at the end. And hearing those two guards mock him like that really pisses me off. I don't know about you guys, but I kill everyone in that prison once I hear that. Justice for Stede. Though he never outright says it, I think Edward felt guilt for Stede's death. He appeared in that nightmare sequence when Edward is drunk and basically condemning himself for everything he's done, because if not for him, Stede probably never would have become a pirate, and he'd likely still be alive at his plantation with his family. But I doubt Stede would blame him. Like he said, he treasured his friendship with Edward more than anything. Resync has a lot of opportunity to fill in blanks with Stede in his life that the original game couldn't cover. It makes perfect sense why the original game couldn't cover much of it. It's Edward's story after all, and there are a lot of characters in Black Flag. Some had to receive more focus than others, and Stede is only relevant in Edward's journey to a certain point. But an entire side quest arc really provides the time and opportunity the main story couldn't afford to solely focus on Stede. It'd be nice to dive a little more into the life he left behind and why he turned to piracy. I mean, we know the general reasoning in the game, but I'm sure there's a little more nuance to it that can be explored. What exactly about his domestic life felt so suffocating to him? I could imagine some scenes of him opening up to Edward on some of that stuff. It'd also be nice to see a different side of him in these quests. He's consistently portrayed in this upbeat, comedic tone in Black Flag, but beneath that warm, positive exterior, he was a very depressed person. So I'd like to see them peel back the layers and reach the emotional core of his character a little more. Again, something they couldn't really do much of in the main story because he's there to fulfill a very specific role as comic relief. I don't know if it'd be possible for us to actually see his death, since obviously Edward isn't there when it happens. He's hanged in December of 1718, like a couple weeks after Blackbeard's killed, So I'm not really sure if they could manufacture a way for Edward to be in Charlestown to witness Stede's execution. They could always show his death completely separate from Edward, or maybe a scene with Edward actually acknowledging and grieving Stede for a brief moment. Just some form of closure to what happens to him outside of a brief mention in some ambient dialogue between two guards. I think he deserves that. Stede Bonnet was a true friend, and of all the deaths in Black Flag, his has always hit particularly hard for me despite it being completely off-screen. Unlike the other pirates portrayed in the game, he was such a positive, wholesome guy who really looked up to Edward, even though he probably shouldn't have, making it especially sad and tragic knowing how his story unfolded. Rest in peace, Stede. You were a real one.